Hey everybody, welcome to the week 5 lecture. You know the drill by now. I'm going to run through some of the big topics that we're going to go over this week in the American Yop reading, and this lecture is just going to give you the kind of broad overview of how some of it fits together and how some of it fits into our major course themes. So the first one I want to look at for week 5 picks up who is an American theme. We talked a little bit about some aspects of civil rights back in week 4. I want to pick up that story now, just a second. So if you think back to week 4, we talked about mostly kind of legal efforts being made to address racism and segregation. You can think about stuff like the NAACP's actions, the Brown versus Board of Education decision, stuff like that. What I want to look at this week is some of the really iconic stuff I think we think about when we think about the civil rights movement. I'm sure a lot of this stuff's pretty familiar, so I'm going to go through it pretty quickly. But it certainly does build on that idea of using courts and the law to improve conditions, especially for African Americans. But as we'll see, there's some new strategies involved as well. Here's where you can read a little bit more about that in American Yop. So one of the real innovations that started in the 1950s and really flourished in the 1960s is this kind of new toolkit for addressing these problems, not just in the courts, but in the streets and through people's wallets, largely through various forms of nonviolent protest. So a really famous example of this is the Montgomery bus boycott. Montgomery, Alabama was an extremely segregated city. Notoriously, the bus system was highly segregated and unfair to black residents. So the black community of Montgomery got together and boycotted the bus. Right? This is something we'll see a few times. A couple really important components of this phase of civil rights is one, get people to listen by hitting them in the wallet, and two, call attention to your issue, especially by taking the high ground. Right? If you can show that your enemy is the one who is cruel and violent and you are peaceful, this is going to gain you a lot of support, often among people who hadn't really given the issue very much thought in the past. So the Montgomery bus boycott went on for over a year and ultimately did result in the desegregation of the buses. And this is just the start of this new phase of civil rights. It also was saw the emergence of, by far, the most famous and iconic figure in the civil rights era, Martin Luther King. He had been a kind of relatively unknown minister. He was only in his 20s in Montgomery, but he took on this leadership role in the boycott, and that made him a national voice in the civil rights struggle, as I'm sure most or all of you know. So, this is going on in the mid-50s. There's a little bit of a lull in the late 50s, but by 1960, it was we really start to see aggressive action being taken, largely through nonviolent protest. So, again, a lot of this is spurred by young people. Martin Luther King was only in his 20s when all this began. The Greensboro sit-ins were launched by college students, right? People like you, who were protesting segregation at a Woolworths, which was a department store. And their strategy was just sit in the restaurant. The idea being, A, they are taking away a spot for a paying customer, and B, this calls a lot of attention to their cause, right? When people start, when this movement expands, and very often sit-in protesters were the victims of violence and humiliation. An important thing to remember with all of this, unlike a lot of the previous civil rights activism we've talked about, is this stuff's going to start to play out on people's televisions. And so people around the world are going to see and to some extent experience what's going on in these protests. And when people tune into their TV and they see peaceful college kids getting violently torn from their seats, humiliated by having ketchup poured on their heads and all sorts of stuff like that, it's going to start to really shape hearts and minds. That's an important part of the story. So throughout the 60s, there's this building on this idea of using nonviolent protest to call attention to the injustice of the issue. We see it in Greensboro starting in 1960. In 1961, a group of black and white civil rights activists rode interstate buses. The idea being interstate bus travel was supposed to be desegregated, but everyone knew that it wasn't in practice. And so freedom riders would go to bus stations, particularly in the South, and if there was still a, say, coloreds-only sign, white people would use that facility, or vice versa. Right? If there's a whites-only sign, black protesters would use that facility. Legally speaking, they're supposed to be able to do that, but very often local police would beat up these protesters. Again, a lot of this gets a lot of publicity. and calls attention to the issue. A year later, at Ole Miss, the University of Mississippi, a black student was admitted, and thousands of white Mississippians showed up to protest against his admission. Violence broke out. There was basically total chaos. Thousands of federal troops had to show up to quell this disturbance, all because one black student, wanted to enroll at Mississippi. And so again, for a lot of everyday people who hadn't really given this very much thought, they turn on their TVs and they see this, what seems to be pretty irrational overreaction to one kid who wants to go to college. Again, calling more and more attention to the injustice of all of this. And then this really starts to come to a head in 1963, where Martin Luther King is leading protests in Alabama, particularly in Birmingham. Again, very iconic images come out of this, of protesters, nonviolent protesters, being attacked with dogs, blasted with water hoses. The hose thing might not seem like a big deal, but these hoses were powerful enough to blast the bark off of a tree. So you can see footage of people just getting tumbled across streets in places like Birmingham. And so at this point, in addition to this sort of street-level local protest, there are increasing calls for some sort of federal legislative action, some sort of a law that will address this problem. And it's working its way through the Congress in the mid-1963. This is when the March on Washington happened. I mentioned the sort of idea of a March on Washington had been planted decades earlier, back during the Depression and into World War II. At this point, it actually happened, and hundreds of thousands of protesters came. This is where Martin Luther King gave his iconic I Have a Dream speech. I'm not going to show you that in the interest of time, but I highly recommend some of you watch it. It is, very likely the greatest and most famous speech ever given in the United States. All of this is meant to put pressure on Congress to act, to pass some sort of a law that will allow the movement to stop fighting this battle piecemeal, right? Buses here, trains here, restaurants here, and just wholesale ban segregation. And you finally get that in 1964. At this point, John F. Kennedy, who had been president, had been killed, and Lyndon Johnson, who we'll talk about a little later, helped usher this in. What the Civil Rights Act basically did was ban segregation in public facilities. So all these things we've talked about in the past, right? Trains and buses and schools and restaurants, all that stuff has to be desegregated due to the Civil Rights Act. The following year, there's a companion legislation called the Voting Rights Act, meant to end the practice of disenfranchisement. This basically empowered the federal government to oversee elections in states with a history of electoral discrimination. It's a little beyond the scope of our course. I'll try to talk about it a little bit in the week 6 lecture, but some of the really important parts of this have been or probably will be stripped away. And so some of the protections against unfair elections have been modified and reduced in the last 10 to 15 years or so. But again, we'll try to get to that next week. Now, we've been focusing primarily on the African American civil rights movement, but there are plenty of other groups in the United States who are also excluded from much of the promise of the United States, much of the equality and opportunity the United States is meant to provide. And a lot of those groups are looking at the African American civil rights movement for inspiration and use a lot of the same tools to advance their own goals. So, for example, especially out in California, but also here in Texas, you've got a very large and vocal Latino protest movement. A lot of this is migrant farm workers who were underpaid, discriminated against, often abused, fighting for their own rights, their own right to unionize, their own right to fair pay. And they used a lot of the same strategies. One of the most iconic leaders here was Cesar Chavez, and they used some of the same tools from the civil rights movement of boycotts and protests and marches. And this rallied the nation to, for example, boycott agricultural products that were produced by non-union farm labor. And this did bear fruit in the 60s, where the United Farm Workers were given the right to unionize migrant workers in California and elsewhere. So we've got Latinos sort of following in the footsteps of the civil rights movement. Native Americans also. They've kind of disappeared from our story in this course to some extent. Last time we talked about Native Americans was at Wounded Knee, where there's this horrific slaughter of innocent Native Americans on a reservation, which basically ended the era of active resistance to white encroachment and civilization, assimilation. And since then, yeah, the pattern had been for Native American tribes to basically be herded onto reservations, many of which had terrible conditions, very, very poor economies, very lacking in opportunities, very high levels of drug and alcohol abuse. And so to call attention to that issue, once again, we get public protest. The most famous example of this is the occupation of Alcatraz, which had been a prison. I'm sure some of you have heard of that, or you've seen the movie The Rock or something like that. But Native Americans said, this was native land at one point. Now it's unused federal property. We're going to take it back. Now, this is more of a symbolic gesture than a practical one. But again, it's a way to put the issue in front of the American people on American televisions and call attention to the fact that there are plenty of groups in the United States still experiencing inequality and discrimination. One group we really have not talked about is gays and lesbians, who for most of the history of this course have been really, as a matter of survival, excluded from and hidden from public life. In almost every part of the United States, if a gay person was outed as gay, they risked losing their job, they risked being shunned by their families, right? The amount of discrimination against gay people was enormous and probably a little bit hard to fathom for people living in the United States today. There certainly had been some efforts at activism in decades prior, but it was really difficult. I talked a little bit during the Cold War period, and you read a little bit in the Cold War period. Gay men and women were one of the primary targets of the Cold War and the sort of anti-communist hysteria. We call that the Lavender Scare. So this is a group that kind of by definition, just as a matter of survival, had been out of the public eye and avoiding a lot of public activism in most parts of the United States. That really changed in 1969. There's this famous moment at a bar in New York City called the Stonewall Inn, where a group of gay customers who were basically being harassed by police fought back, and for the first time kind of allowed an amount of public visibility to that movement that hadn't really been available before. And this led to a sort of gay liberation movement, the pressure and the sort of urging of people to come out and be vocal and be open about their sexuality, to try to end the stigma and end the necessity of people hiding who they are. And this is an issue that has really accelerated just in the last couple of decades. Since the 60s, for decades, still there was very widely accepted homophobia in the media and in culture and stuff like that. And then just in the last couple of decades, we have this really rapid improvement in this area, the granting of gay marriage in particular. So this is an area of activism that saw pretty remarkable steps forward just in the last couple of decades, really in most of your lifetimes. And then the last group I'll talk about in this section is women. We've talked about women before as, there's kind of always this tension of these traditional ideas of women as homemakers, having this kind of domestic role, versus women either by choice or by necessity taking a more public role, right? That could be either taking a job or participating in, for example, progressive reform activism, stuff like that. Back in World War II, we have kind of the Rosie the Riveter idea of women taking on jobs they hadn't been able to do before World War II. So there's always this kind of tension. Thinking about the 1950s, the period right before what we're talking about today, pretty conservative time when it comes to at least popular conceptions of gender roles, right? You get all these 50s sitcoms with squeaky clean nuclear families and mom who stays home and bakes pies all day or whatever. By the 60s, that idea started to be challenged. A really important moment in that story is the publication of Betty Friedan's Feminine Mystique. She had been kind of like a 50s housewife, basically, and noticed how unfulfilling it was for her and a lot of her friends and neighbors. She wrote this book about it called The Feminine Mystique that really called out this idea that, American popular culture expects women to be one certain way, whereas a lot of women were sort of chafing under the restrictions of that. And that opens up this whole, multiple avenues of protest against those restrictions, which really, again, kind of date way back. And so you get kind of women's liberation movements looking for more kind of, you can think about it as a couple branches, right? There's one branch looking for kind of practical equality, right? Equal pay for equal work, equal job opportunities, equal educational opportunities, stuff like that. And then a kind of broader cultural critique. The word patriarchy is more common now than then, but that idea that so in so many ways there's this sort of gender inequality baked into American life and American culture. They're sort of calling that out starting in the late 1960s, and that's obviously also really transformed American society in all sorts of ways since. I haven't crunched the numbers for this particular class, but the overwhelming majority of students at Lone Star College and most colleges in the United States are women at this point. And obviously women's visibility in many professions they were excluded from even a couple decades ago is much more prominent today as a result of all this. So, one of the really key themes of the 1960s is this kind of opening up of who gets to participate fully in American life, right? We had a system that was very much along, you can think about racial lines, gender lines, lines of sexuality, kind of really baked in hierarchy, and all that hierarchical power structure starts to become challenged pretty intensely along many fronts in the 1960s. Now, if you think back to African Americans, right, we have this fulfillment of many of the civil rights movement's goals with the Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act, and yet, by the mid and late 60s, it's becoming clear that's just not going to solve every problem. You still got a lot of inequality. You've still got a lot of poverty in black communities. You've still got a lot of discrimination and violence going on. So you've got new movements kind of breaking out of that. A really important kind of counterweight to the Martin Luther King nonviolent protest strategy is Malcolm X, who called for a much more sort of militant, confrontational view and stance, rooted in things like self-defense, right? If Martin Luther King was urging people to kind of turn the other cheek and behave peacefully, Malcolm X would say, no, people should defend themselves. He was not calling for acts of aggressive violence, but he was saying that just being passive, accepting inequality and accepting violence was inadequate for the moment. And so you've got people like Malcolm X, you've got groups like the Black Panthers expressing this continued frustration and this much more confrontational approach that look where nonviolence got us. We've still got inequality, we've still got poverty, we've still got crime and all sorts of other issues in black communities, and these groups are taking a much more vocal stance against that stuff. One of the flashpoints for this in the 1970s was, well, okay, the Supreme Court says, the law says segregation's illegal now. The problem is cities were segregated. They're geographically segregated. And the really famous example is Boston. Right? Boston was extremely racially segregated. We think of segregation as a southern phenomenon, but it's going on in northern cities as well. And the Supreme Court said, well, Boston has to desegregate its schools. So some of the kids from the white neighborhoods and some of the kids from the black neighborhoods need to be integrated. And the way they were going to do that was through busing. They're going to basically bus some black kids from black neighborhoods to white neighborhoods and vice versa. This led to enormous protests. I don't know how many of you are sports fans, but a multi-episode documentary about the Boston Celtics came out a couple months ago. And the first and maybe second, I forget exactly, but several episodes really deal really closely with this. So those of you who are interested in kind of the intersection of sports and politics, there's really interesting analysis of Boston's racial dynamics and all this busing. The really famous image that came out of this is this one where a white man's literally attacking a black man with an American flag. It's like the metaphor creates itself. The documentary talks about that. It's like because I'm doing this live, I don't have it in front of me. I'm blanking on the name. Oh, it's called Celtic City. Highly recommended if you're interested in this stuff. Another problem that kind of starts to intersect. We'll talk about the economy in a minute. But one of the other things that intersects with all this is a lot of cities start to experience economic decline. And that disproportionately affects a lot of black communities, especially in cities, especially cities in what we now call the Rust Belt, like Detroit, Chicago, places like that, where there's massive disinvestment in those communities. And that leads to kind of this cyclical problem of, let's say a factory shuts down, that causes lots of people to flee the neighborhood because there's maybe opportunities elsewhere. That hollows out the tax base, which means things like buses get shut down, so now people can't use the bus to get to their jobs. They lose their job. Now they're not pumping money into the local economy. That causes other businesses to fail. So there's kind of this really harmful kind of downward spiral in a lot of American cities that also complicates these problems, especially in black communities in the United States. So we're going to put a pin in that story for now. As always, we can see some really important steps forward especially through things like the Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act, but we also see the continuation of some of the same problems we've seen since the beginning of the course. I want to shift gears now to look at the U.S. and the world. If you think back to last time, we talked about the Cold War as kind of the dominant fact of American foreign policy, starting at the end of World War II. And that's going to explain a lot of what we talk about here. Last time we talked about, there were kind of violent flare-ups of the Cold War in places like Korea. We talked about covert action in places like Guatemala or Iran. The big story for our period this week is in Vietnam. America's involvement in Vietnam cannot be understood except through the lens of the Cold War. As with so many of America's foreign actions in this period, it starts with the idea that communism is threatening to spread in the world. We can think way back to the Truman Doctrine, this idea that the United States was committed since World War II. If communism reared its ugly head anywhere, the United States was going to do whatever it could to stop it. Now, in the case of Vietnam, one really important thing to think about with the Cold War is that it kind of put lenses on American policymakers' eyes, right? The world's complicated, and the world has this deep, complicated history, but when you put on those Cold War lenses, everything becomes really simple. It's us against them. It's communism versus anti-communism, when really there's often a lot else going on. So in the case of Vietnam, Vietnam had been under foreign occupation and control for centuries, right? For a long time under Chinese control, and then since the 1800s, French control. And so many Vietnamese were chafing under French rule for decades, starting back in the middle of the 1800s. And by the early 1900s, there's this independence movement. One of the leaders of it is the person you see on your screen who went by the name Ho Chi Minh. And Ho Chi Minh's idea was, we want national self-determination, just like the United States would expect, or the other nations of Europe would expect. And so he's fighting basically an anti-colonial struggle. Communism is a tool for him to achieve his anti-colonial goals. And by the 1950s, Ho Chi Minh and his followers successfully kicked the French out, got themselves out from under French rule. So then the question's now what? We can think back to like the Philippines, right? The Philippines got out from under Spanish rule, and the United States essentially swooped in and took over. So the question is, what's going to happen in Vietnam? And the answer is basically the United States becomes the new France, not holding Vietnam as a formal colony, but certainly putting it under political and increasingly military control. And so what had been this sort of independence struggle for Vietnam now gets sort of seen through Cold War glasses. Right? The United States sees Ho Chi Minh, they see him as a communist above all, whereas I think he would primarily describe himself as a nationalist, right? Someone who wants control over his own country for his people. But the United States sees Ho Chi Minh as a threat and starts to take action to get communism out of Vietnam. They do that by supporting the anti-communist side in a divided Vietnam. So back to Korea. In some ways, there's some parallels here, right? Think back to Korea, where the northern half of Korea was aligned with communism, and the southern half was aligned with the United States. Very similar thing going on in Vietnam, where Ho Chi Minh and his followers, they are in control of North Vietnam. North Vietnam is communist and aligned with China. South Vietnam is basically largely administered with the help of and approval of the United States. They're very much under American control, if not formally, very clearly. So we've got kind of two things going on at once here. We've got North versus South, for sure, communism versus anti-communism. But then even within the South, within South Vietnam, there are huge numbers of pro-communist forces. So for the United States, their task is really difficult. They have to not only attempt to defeat the communists in North Vietnam, they also have to deal with significant communist forces in the South. And one of the problems facing the United States is that South Vietnamese leadership was, by many parts of the South Vietnamese population, disliked. This is an image some of you might have seen before. But to protest the South Vietnamese government's policies against Buddhism, right? This is a largely Buddhist country, where while the South Vietnamese government was run by a Catholic named Diem, D-I-E-M. Sorry, I apologize. My pronunciation of any Vietnamese word is not going to be good. But to protest Diem's policies that were restrictive of Buddhist practice, a Buddhist monk went to the square in Saigon and lit himself on fire. This became a really iconic image of resistance to Vietnamese control, South Vietnamese control. So the United States is propping up the government in South Vietnam, attempting to keep communism out. But again, the problem is communists are functionally in control. Even if there's a line drawn and it says South Vietnam is aligned with the United States, much of the actual practical territory is held by communist-friendly forces that you often hear referred to as the Viet Cong. So, the goal here is again kind of containment, right? Let's contain communism where it already is. The problem is it really just isn't working well. The United States sort of gets involved in stages, but in 1964, there's this report that the North Vietnamese have attacked an American ship. And we now know that almost definitely didn't happen, but it became the justification. Again, think back to the Spanish-American War, this idea, hey, Spain attacked us, we need to go to war against Spain. That was not true either. This incident in the Gulf of Tonkin probably didn't happen, and yet it provides the impetus, it provides the rationale for the United States to much more fully commit to war in Vietnam, the goal of which is clear South Vietnam of communists and defeat the communists in North Vietnam. And so more and more American men start to go to Vietnam, more and more bombs start to fall on North Vietnam. Much of this war is devastating for local people and local environments. You've got, for example, the use of napalm, which just incinerates much of the forest canopy, especially in South Vietnam. You've got hundreds and then thousands of American men dying, hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese people being injured and killed, often civilians, women, children, due to these kind of indiscriminate bombing campaigns. Like I said with civil rights, another thing to think about with all this is it's playing out on American television screens. And so people start to see really violent, horrific images coming out of Vietnam. This is a famous image of a Viet Cong man being executed in the street by someone who's, on America's side. And so to see our side executing people in cold blood in the street is disturbing to a lot of people. Now, there certainly was a very active anti-war movement in the United States. Hundreds of thousands of people came out to protest against the Vietnam War. The problem was, it was just really difficult to extricate, right? We got the Cold War, right? We can't let communism spread. We've got this sort of, I would say a lot of historians would argue, this kind of, at this point the president is Lyndon Johnson. Kind of this macho element to this, where Lyndon Johnson doesn't want to be the president to lose Vietnam. He doesn't want to be the first president to lose an American war. So the war grinds on. Behind the scenes, people knew that the United States wasn't winning and probably would not win this war. But publicly, Lyndon Johnson and others are saying, we're winning, victory's just around the corner, we've got this. But bit by bit, it's becoming clear that's not true. And one of the really important moments is this moment called the Tet Offensive, where the Viet Cong launched this massive attack on American and South Vietnamese facilities in 1968, and really just kind of catch the United States with its pants down, and reveals what became known as the credibility gap. Credibility just kind of means believability, right? We keep hearing this war is going to end any day. We keep hearing that we're going to win, and yet, where's the victory? Things just seem to be getting worse and worse. Stories come in of horrific atrocities committed against civilians at places like My Lai. Lyndon Johnson, we'll talk about the political side of him in a minute, but he came in as the president with enormous optimism, a lot of public support, and the Vietnam War is going to destroy him and destroy his presidency. This is kind of a silly picture. It's just him showing reporters this scar he had from an appendectomy. I put it up here as kind of a metaphor, though, because a newspaper did this cartoon, which showed that Vietnam is Lyndon Johnson's scar. So just to be explicit about this, Lyndon Johnson was elected in 1964. We'll talk about that. In 1968, he's up for re-election, and he decides not to run again, which is pretty uncommon, especially for a president as ambitious as Johnson. This is a guy who thought he was going to be the next FDR. He thought he was going to be one of the greatest presidents ever, and he quit, largely because of the Vietnam War. And so the Vietnam War, at the end of Johnson's presidency, still not turning around. More and more horrific events seem to be occurring. There was an anti-war protest in 1970 where 4 college protesters were killed. And by 1975, I'll talk about Richard Nixon a little bit later. I'm going to kind of get through this as quick as I can. By 1975, the United States abandoned South Vietnam, and the United States lost this war. And there's a couple of things we can think about in terms of the Vietnam War's legacies. One is certainly just this idea of the Cold War lenses, that the United States wanted to see the world as kind of simple. It's us versus them, communism versus anti-communism, when in reality, things are more complicated on the ground. And I think the other thing to think about here is this really reveals something about the United States that a lot of people were facing in the 1970s, which is this sense of limits. Right? If you think about the United States at the end of World War II, the United States in the 1950s, there's just this sense of boundless optimism that the United States can do anything it wants to, deliver any promise that it makes, give people the life they want and all that. By the 70s, it's becoming clear in a lot of ways, some of which I'll talk about a little later, that's not true. Here's Vietnam, a country much, much smaller than the United States, much less technologically advanced, much less wealthy, and yet they defeated the most powerful army in the history of the world, which is the United States, at least in theory. So this is kind of showing Americans we can't just do whatever we want. We can't just involve ourselves in global conflicts and get the outcomes we want. And again, we'll look at some other stuff next week. You probably know this from your own knowledge of your own lifetime. This is a lesson we keep learning over and over. The United States cannot just get the outcome it wants because it wants it when it gets involved with other nations' business, because usually things are much more complicated on the ground than we tend to want to admit. Again, we'll look at other examples of that later. Now, that's not bad enough. Again, I'm going to go through this really quickly just because I don't want it to get too bogged down. In terms of limits, a few years later, there's this revolution in Iran, basically against, overthrowing the government the United States installed in the 1950s. In the course of that, dozens of Americans were taken hostage, and the United States failed in its efforts to get them home for well over a year. So again, there's just this sense in the 70s that we're literally taken hostage, right? We keep thinking we can do whatever we want because we're so powerful, and yet all these other countries where we get involved show us that we don't always get the outcome that we want. Now, we head into the 1980s. Again, I'll talk about Ronald Reagan from a political perspective a little bit later. But one of the things Ronald Reagan did as president in the 1980s was kind of ramp up the Cold War again. Back in the 40s and 50s, there's all this fear that the atomic war will destroy us all. A lot of that stuff got pretty calmed down, usually due to the careful acts of leaders and diplomats. But in the 80s, we're kind of back to this good and evil story. There's a lot of Hollywood movies that kind of make this point. Some of you have probably seen like Rocky IV and stuff like that, where there's like the big evil Soviet villain and then the valiant American that defeats him. So in the 80s, there's just this kind of assumption the Cold War's here to stay. The Cold War's how the world is going to be for the foreseeable future. What a lot of Americans didn't really realize, again, because we're given this image of the big evil empire of the Soviet Union, is the Soviet Union was kind of never as strong as we thought they were, or as it was portrayed to average Americans in the 1980s. Their economy was weak, and many other aspects of their society was not working well. Their grip over the countries they controlled, like East Germany or Poland or Czechoslovakia, really started to slip by the late 1980s. All sorts of stuff was kind of undermining American credibility at this time. I'm going to kind of skip over this, other than to say in the late 80s, there's this big scandal in the Reagan administration where the United States was selling weapons to our enemy in Iran in order to illegally fund anti-communist forces in Nicaragua. If that sounds really weird and shady, it was. You can look up the Iran-Contra and American YOP and elsewhere. But again, there's just this sense that events are kind of out of the control of the United States, and they don't always match up with what people are expecting. And yet, for all that, in 1989, the communist bloc, the Soviet Union, the whole thing kind of starts to crumble. The really iconic moment in that story is the fall of the Berlin Wall in East Germany. Basically, for decades, there was this iron grip of control over East Germany by the Soviet Union, symbolized by this wall that surrounded West Berlin. Well, in 1989, the people, for decades, if you had tried to cross that wall or tear it down, you'd be shot by sentries. In 1989, when it became clear the authority structure of the Soviet Union is kind of breaking down, people tore the wall down, and that became this kind of symbol of the end of the Cold War. And so one question that comes up a lot is, well, why did that happen? How did that happen? Why did the Cold War end, and how did the Soviet Union fall? And I think there's a lot of answers we could give, but I would argue there was just this fundamental weakness within the Soviet Union in terms of its system, its politics, its economy. It became very kind of old and crusty and broken. I can't resist showing this image. So this is actually at a Randall's in Clear Lake, Texas. Boris Yeltsin, who was the head of the Soviet Union at the end, he came to this area to go to NASA. And he went to this local grocery store in Clear Lake, Texas, of all places, and saw the consumer abundance available to American consumers in just some, kind of random community in the United States. And the stories are that he was on the plane back home just kind of shocked by this, right? The Soviet Union thought it was going to create this kind of communist utopia for its people, and it was becoming clear by the late 1980s that it hadn't panned out, that we've got empty store shelves in the Soviet Union and abundant, onions and potatoes in Clear Lake, Texas. And so I think I just use that as kind of a metaphor that there are these kind of internal problems in the Soviet Union that by the end just could not be ignored. If any of you have seen or read about the Chernobyl incident in the 1980s, that kind of feeds into that story as well. So we've talked about who's an American. We've talked about America's role abroad. I'm going to shift gears now to look at the economy. And again, this fits right into that theme I mentioned before of limits. We're learning in events like the Vietnam War, the United States can't get every outcome that it wants. We're also going to see in the 1970s, the United States learn the lesson that our economy isn't always going to boom. It isn't always going to grow. Things aren't always going to get better for the next generation, which is perhaps something that some of you are thinking about today, as I think we're still learning that lesson. So economists actually call the early 70s period the Great U-turn, right? If you think about coming out of World War II, we talked about this booming economy, consumer abundance, a swelling middle class. That seemed like that's just how things are going to be, right? The middle class is going to grow, people's salaries are going to grow, their purchasing power is going to just grow forever. Started in the 1970s, that turned around, and in many respects has never come back. Starting at, the absolute peak of the American economy is basically the 60s into the 70s. That starts going down in the early 70s, and we've never really recovered in terms of an expanding middle class, more purchasing power for the average American, that kind of thing. So the question is, what happened? A bunch of stuff happened. So the outcome of all this is going to be what I have here, that period from the kind of 30s to the 70s, which people wanted to believe was like a permanent thing, proved to be the anomaly. The reality in most of American history is that the economy is deeply unequal, that a small number of people hold a huge portion of the wealth, and the average person holds very little. That's very, very true today. It was very, very true in 1929 before the stock market crashed. It was very true in the Gilded Age. It was very true in 1776. Right? The American economy in general is deeply unequal. And that has all sorts of consequences for the average person. But now a lot of economists look back at that sort of 30s through 70s period as this exception. We had this one kind of golden moment where the middle class grew, where the average person's economic status got better, their kids did better than they did. There were a few decades where we could count on that. But starting in the 70s and 80s, that turned around, and it never came back. And I think, as people look towards the future, the large and growing gap between a small number of rich people at the top and a huge number of poor and working class people at the bottom, that gap is going to have all sorts of consequences for how really the rest of your lives play out, believe it or not. So again, what happened? A couple things. First, due to stuff I'm not really going to get into, the global supply of oil was restricted. Basically, Middle Eastern countries cut off our access to oil. Well, supply and demand says if you have less access to something, i.e. oil, energy, the cost of that thing is going to go up. So the price of gasoline goes up, the availability of gasoline goes down. And then if the price of gasoline goes up, the price of everything goes up. That's inflation. You all know about inflation. It's been one of the dominant economic factors of your entire lives, especially your remembered lives, especially since the COVID period 5 years ago. Inflation back then was even worse. At its peak in the 70s, we had years where inflation was like 13%. So that means if you have $100 on January 1st, that same $100 will buy you what $87 bought you the year before. So you've lost 13% of your money's value. That happens a couple years in a row. It crushes the value of your savings. It crushes the value of your investments. And that's going on for millions of Americans in the 1970s. Inflation gets out of control, and then that's coupled with, and again, there's economic explanations that are a little bit beyond me. I'm not an economist, and it's just not going to be a good use of our time, but just sort of take my word for it that for most of history, economists sort of assumed that an economy can be bad in one of two ways. Either there's high inflation, which is bad because you can't buy as much stuff, or there's unemployment and declining growth, which is bad because people don't have jobs. But the assumption was you could fix one by messing with the other, right? If there's high unemployment, you could say lower interest rates, intentionally create inflation, that'll boost job growth. Or vice versa. If inflation's bad, you can restrict the money supply, that will potentially hurt jobs, but bring inflation down. We're dealing with this exact problem right now. It's not nearly as dramatic as it was in the 70s, but we've got a lot of years ahead of us. It's hard to say. But what happens in the 70s is both of those things happen. Inflation goes up and jobs and growth go down, which is pretty disastrous. Economists had to coin a new term for it, which they called stagflation. And so this just sort of sucks the wind out of the American economy, out of all that post-war optimism that we saw back in the 40s and 50s. Again, this is coupled with businesses de-investing in American manufacturing. You hear about this now as if it's a product of NAFTA and recent economic decisions, but for decades, American companies have been shuttering their factories in the United States and reopening them abroad where wages are lower, or replacing American workers with machines. I won't get too dragged into today, what's going on today, but American manufacturing's never going to come back to what it was. Companies are never going to pay American workers middle-class wages when they can either replace them with robots or replace them with people around the world who demand about 1/10 or less of what an American worker demands. So that old idea we had of an American middle class based on blue-collar jobs and factory work, I'm going to argue, we'll be long gone from each other's lives pretty soon. But I'll go ahead and predict that's never coming back, and any policy that attempts to do that is unlikely to succeed. So, as you can see, manufacturing employment has been declining for decades. That old blue-collar middle class has been disappearing for decades, either, again, replaced by machines or sent abroad. And again, this has all sorts of kind of spiraling consequences, right? And it also just sort of sucks all that economic energy out of the economy. So I want to kind of end this section with a little metaphor. I showed this picture, I guess last week or the week before, as kind of a symbol of post-war 50s optimism, right? Here's this kind of rocket ship of a car that's going to blast us into this beautiful economic future. Pretty unprofessional, guys. My phone alarm went off. Hang on a second. Sorry about that. So what I want to show you now is this is a 1951 Buick LeSabre. What I want to show you now is a 1979 Buick LeSabre. I'm showing you this car in particular because this is the car, not the exact car, but the exact same model and color of the car I drove to high school. When I was in high school in the 90s, I bought one of these for $400. It was a big, slow piece of shit that got about 8 miles to the gallon, but back then gas was cheap and I didn't care. So, this is what a 1979 Buick LeSabre looks like. Now, I know some of you might think that's cool. I have students who think it's cool. I mean, it does have a certain old-school charm to it, but I think it's pretty obviously not a rocket ship. Right? I would argue that this is a car made by very optimistic people. This is a car made by sort of depressed, defeated people. So, by the end of the 70s, there's just this sense that the wind is out of America's sails. We're looking for answers. The idea that comes along with Ronald Reagan, I'll talk about Ronald Reagan in a minute, is what we now call Reaganomics. The kind of technical term for it is supply-side economics. Reagan's big economic philosophy is we need to cut taxes, especially on rich people. For what it's worth, this is exactly the economic philosophy of the second Trump administration so far. Cut taxes on everyone, especially rich people. The idea is that the people at the top of the economic pyramid, they're the ones who run businesses, they're the ones who provide jobs, they're the ones who invest in the economy, and if we let them have more money, they will invest it in a way that the benefits will trickle down to the rest of us. So you often hear this called trickle-down economics. Critics of this say it does trickle down, but not in the way we want. I'll let you look at that political cartoon for a minute to get at the essence of this. But we have run this experiment several times, and the outcome of trickle-down economics so far tends to be a massive rise in inequality. Since the Ronald Reagan administration in the early 1980s, the gap between the wealthy and poor has expanded enormously. The vast majority of people have seen their share of the American economic pie go down, and the people at the very, 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 very tip top of the economic ladder have seen their money go way, way, way up. So more and more wealth gets concentrated into fewer and fewer hands. That sort of trickle-down idea has not really played out in practice so far. And again, we're going to run another experiment of that in the next few years. We'll see what happens. But one really bedrock fact here, and you can look at this for what happens after the economic recession in the late 2000s. You can look at it for what happened after the recession that came with COVID. Every time, the big winner are the people at the top. There have been no exceptions to that in recent events. So we'll end the economic part of this lecture today just with this idea that, we did have this interesting little window from the 30s to the 70s where the middle class did grow, where there was a lot of economic optimism in the future. I would say the 70s and 80s basically killed off that idea. Polls for decades always showed that Americans believed their kids would do better than they did economically. That's no longer true. And I would argue it's largely the result of some of these policies that distribute a lot of wealth in relatively few hands. Again, we saw the exact same thing in the lead up to the Great Depression. Historians aren't in the prediction business, but certainly from a historical perspective, generally speaking, when the gap between the wealthy and the poor gets big enough, bad things tend to happen. All right, so the last topic I want to look at here is politics. Again, I've touched on some of this already, so I want to, as always, try to move quickly through this. We'll see how I do. There's some of the chapters that cover this stuff. Really broadly, if you look at the 1960s are largely under Democratic presidents John F. Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson. Those two, especially Johnson, like modern Democrats, tend to want to use the government to try to alleviate social and economic problems. For Johnson, that was a set of programs called the Great Society. He kind of saw this as the next step in the story, building on progressivism and the New Deal. Right? The progressivism era saw the government taking on new roles, trying to soften some of the effects of capitalism and the modern industrial economy. And the New Deal not only dealt with the Great Depression, but built in some safeguards against those things, like Social Security and the Wagner Act and that sort of thing. The Great Society, Lyndon Johnson, he sees this as the next big step in that story. I'm going to skip over this election debate 1960 stuff. It's funny, but not that important. There's Lyndon Johnson again. Great Society. There's some fun stuff in there, but you guys can live without it. One of the things it tries to do is defeat poverty. There's a whole part of the Great Society called the War on Poverty. It's worth noting this was not just sort of welfare and handouts. The idea was that the government's going to create this structure of loans and training programs and stuff like that to try to improve people's economic standing. It also did have components of direct poverty relief. One of the problems with the War on Poverty, though, is it just was underinvested. Again, a lot of America's money at this point is going to the Vietnam War. And so billions of dollars that might have been used for the War on Poverty get siphoned off to pay for the Vietnam War. Again, that's the kind of fundamental tragedy, I would say, of Lyndon Johnson's presidency. Is here's a guy who really didn't care that much about foreign policy. His goal was to transform America here at home. But much of his political energy and economic resources went to fighting the war in Vietnam. So the war on poverty did alleviate poverty in some places to some extent, but was not nearly the success he was hoping it would be. The Great Society also created Medicare and Medicaid, right? This provides health care for either senior citizens or poor Americans. I put these, like, these aren't even real buttons there on the right side of the screen, but just to get at this idea that all the stages of these expansions of America's role, right, whether it's the New Deal, whether it's the Great Society, whether it's Obamacare, it's always met with a lot of resistance. People call it socialism. They say the government shouldn't be doing this stuff. However, once they're created, they're generally really hard to get rid of because no politician really wants to be the one to start taking benefits away from people. But again, we're in very interesting times right now in the second Trump administration. The big, beautiful bill that just passed will cut Medicare spending by billions and eventually trillions of dollars. Millions of people will have reduced Medicare benefits, Medicaid benefits. So we'll see. We'll see to what extent the American population is willing to absorb that. But as part of the cost-cutting efforts of that bill, by definition, people will not have coverage they had before. So again, we'll see. But in general, even Trump has been very vocal throughout his political career. We're not going to touch Social Security, right? He doesn't want to be seen as the president who takes away benefits that people have relied upon for generations. Another important part of the Great Society, which at the time didn't seem like a big deal, but to a large extent now I think is maybe even the biggest part of it, is we had really restricted immigration starting back in the 1920s. The Immigration Act of 1965 opens that up. If you look around in a city like Houston, Houston's the most diverse city in the United States ethnically. That would be impossible without these changes in immigration. Of course, immigration now is this massive political conflict point between the right and the left. That's largely a response to the changes this Immigration Act brought in over the last 50 years or so. 60 years. If you think about the Great Society in general, again, it did create some really worthwhile programs, especially Medicare and Medicaid. But again, I would argue that much of what it hoped to achieve was either distracted or destroyed by the Vietnam War. And so I think coming out of Lyndon Johnson's presidency, we can think of everything that happened since then as a backlash against the 60s. Right? If you think about what we think of when we think about the 60s, civil rights efforts, anti-war protests, the Great Society, there's a big and growing opposition to all of that stuff, which I think is pretty much the backbone of the modern conservative movement. And again, Trump's such a unique individual, and his role in politics is so different from anyone who came before that you could probably find some exceptions when it comes to Trump personally. But if you think about the real core of the conservative movement of the last 60 or so years, it's very directly a response to and a backlash against what we saw in the 60s, whether that's increasing ethnic diversity, whether that's more government programs, whether that's America's role abroad, you name it. A lot of this starts with Nixon, right? Nixon kind of tapped into this idea that a growing number of Americans by the late 60s just kind of couldn't identify with what they see on TV. Again, anti-war protesters, civil rights protests, stuff like that. There's a lot of chaos. There's a lot of turmoil in America in the 60s. A lot of changes, right? The culture is changing really dramatically as well. We'll talk about that next week. So Nixon kind of noticed that, even though we see all these changes on TV, there's a lot of people who don't like this stuff. We might think back in the 60s and think, wow, that stuff was cool. But a lot of Americans didn't think so at the time. Even someone like Martin Luther King, who seems like kind of like a secular saint today, the majority of Americans opposed Martin Luther King's actions and stances while he was alive. So Nixon kind of tapped into that. He called this group the silent majority, right? You look on TV, all you see is chaos and protesters and crime and drugs and all this sort of stuff. Nixon had this idea that he wants to kind of bring us back and be the voice for what he called the silent majority. It was really effective. Here's the political map in 1968. Now here's where things get really interesting for Nixon. I'm going to show you the end of the story here. This is the election map in 1972. So Nixon destroyed his opponent. I would argue that was, partially because people liked Nixon at the time, and also because his opponent, George McGovern, was kind of too liberal for the average, swing voter, independent, undecided American. So a lot of people swung towards Nixon. But I want you to keep this map in mind. heading into 1972, there is no way Nixon's going to lose this election. But something to keep in mind with Nixon is it's not enough for him to win. He wants to sort of crush his enemies. And so in the lead up to the 1972 election, a bunch of shady stuff starts to happen. Nixon becomes convinced there are kind of leaks in his administration. This group of documents called the Pentagon Papers leaked to the press. I'm not going to talk about that for today. So Nixon, and the people around Nixon start to do a bunch of really shady stuff. And one example is some of Nixon's operatives break into the headquarters of the Democratic Party at a place called the Watergate Complex, and they're caught. Right? This is the famous Watergate scandal. And like so many scandals, it's the cover-up that really kills Nixon. And so bit by bit, it becomes clear that all this sort of shady stuff was going on behind the scenes. Crisp unmarked bills and wiretapping and secret codes and all sorts of crazy stuff. And then eventually tapes come out. I think there's some really interesting parallels here between this and what's going on with Epstein right now, where there's these calls to release the Epstein files and little dribbles of information are coming out. But what people are really concerned about is the cover-up, right? So in a lot of ways, I think there's some interesting parallels here where, and you can think about the tape of Epstein in prison where there's the missing minute. A lot of people compare, or missing 3 minutes, whatever it is. A lot of people compare that to these tapes that started to come out of the White House where there are missing minutes. The White House was recorded audio recordings, and the White House was selectively releasing some of these tapes. One of them has missing minutes. That looks really shady. So there's all sorts of speculation about what's going on, and it eventually becomes clear that Nixon and his people were breaking the law. They were doing illegal stuff. It came to light. And so Nixon became the only American president to resign from office while he was in office. Right? Johnson decided not to run again. Nixon actually just quit in the middle of his term. So if you add this to the end of the Vietnam War and the stagflation and all this, there's just this sense by the mid-70s that things have gone off course. We're not as powerful abroad as we thought we were. The economy's not as good as we thought it was. Our government lies to us constantly. Right? They lied to us about Vietnam. They lied to us about Watergate. There's just this deep sort of cynicism growing by the mid to late 1970s. And people are looking for some other course. Now, by the late 70s, a guy named Jimmy Carter was elected. His idea was, I'm not going to lie to the American people. People found that very attractive. But he also just wasn't kind of big enough to meet the moment in a lot of ways. People just didn't see him as a decisive enough leader, right? So basically, if you can think of the 70s, people are kind of flailing around for leadership and meaning, right? Things have kind of gone off course. And that desire to solve that problem leads to this kind of conservative, again, backlash that started with Nixon and then flowers into the election of Ronald Reagan. In a lot of ways, Ronald Reagan weaves together all of this discontent, right? Discontent over the economy, discontent over this feeling that the United States is weak, discontent over too much government, too many taxes. Reagan sort of taps into all of that. Nixon had been a movie star back in the old days, so he was like very good on camera. Again, an interesting parallel with Trump, who was obviously a television star, also very effective as a communicator on television or on the internet or whatever. So Reagan has this very carefully crafted image, right? He's going to be this strong, vigorous leader. He was the oldest president we'd ever had, again. That has since been defeated by Biden and then by Trump. But Reagan's idea is, again, we're going to cut taxes to invigorate the economy. We're going to ramp up the Cold War to kind of reestablish this image of American strength. And by the end of Reagan's term, I would argue there's kind of this mixed record, right? The economic policies objectively led to a massive increase in inequality between the top 1% and everybody else. Now, in terms of the Cold War did end and America did come out on some level victorious. Different historians have different ideas about what role Reagan played in that. My personal interpretation is that's more to do with the internal weakness of the Soviet Union than any specific thing Reagan did. But it is the case that Reagan and his successor, George Herbert Walker Bush, did preside over the end of the Cold War, and the United States kind of came out as victorious there. So if we kind of end our story there in the late 1980s, kind of a mixed bag, right? We've got an end of a really important era, right? The Cold War has organized so much about American life since the 1940s, and now that's over. And I think, not only from 1989's perspective, but from today's perspective, the world has been kind of groping for a new way to understand global events, global dynamics. And in a way, I think we're almost gravitating towards this sort of new multi-sided superpower tension between the United States, China, Russia in particular. You could put the European Union and Europe in there as well. But I think, one way to think about it, I'll try to address some of this next week. Next week, I'll talk about some history, but I'll also kind of give us some food for thought for what's going on now, what might things to pay attention to as we move into the future. But I think, the world and the United States have been sort of groping for a new vision, right? What can we do to create an economy that works? What can we do to create an American role abroad that works? What can we do to deal with the challenge of being a very diverse nation? All these questions basically were articulated in the period I talked about here in week 5, and we're still, I think, trying to figure out how we as a nation and as a world are going to navigate these very confusing times. So I'll talk a little bit about this next week, and then you'll be on your way to live your lives and shape some small part of what happens and see what happens with the rest. So thanks for listening, and I'll see you next week.